Hello, everyone. This is your host, Philip Reiner. I wanted to welcome you to The Fourth Leg. This is a series of podcasts focused on one of the most complex systems in the world today, nuclear command and control, and its increasingly complicated future. Within this series, we're going to go straight to the experts across multiple sectors to talk about the modernization of nuclear command and control systems. Keep an eye on technology for global security in the coming weeks and months as we begin to launch additional podcast series focused on how to fix the internet, AI and global security, and other critical technology and security related issues. For now, we have so much to talk about. Let's get started. For today's podcast, we are joined by our colleague Peter Hayes from the Nautilus Institute. We spoke with Dr. Avner Cohen, who is a writer, historian, and a professor, also a self-proclaimed philosopher turned nuclear historian who teaches down at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey. Dr. Cohen is widely known for his historical research and analysis of Israel's nuclear program and his acclaimed book, Israel and the Bomb. So, Avner, again, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us here today. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
We really like to kick these conversations off by going back to the basics. With your presentation back in January and your paper that you submitted that we're talking about here today, I would argue that it's really pretty unique in terms of how you approach it and put forward the information that you do, which comes from interviews that you've conducted with folks who are directly involved, the research that you've done and published over the years in terms of just examining Israel's nuclear program more broadly. But it's such an opaque set of issues, right? It's such an opaque topic. We really don't often get to talk about these kinds of specifics, even if it isn't the most down in the weeds classified information, right? So to kick things off, I just wanted to ask if you could, particularly for those listeners who haven't had a chance to read the paper yet, if you could just kind of lay out the basics of what your paper and your report identifies as the underpinnings of Israel's NC3 system.
Sure. As I'm going to do that, I would also emphasize a certain kind of disclaimer, which is inherently tied with the way the paper was written. The paper was written in historical fashion and also to some extent in constructivist fashion. That is to say, I used the phrase that I'm trying to detect or to trace or to reconstruct Israel nuclear DNA as it's relevant for questions of command and control. And the reason why I took this method is very much the fact that I feel embarrassed by my ignorance about a great deal of this issue as it relates to the present situation. I do not know beyond understanding the past and understanding some kind of principles that I think likely to be still valid about how the system is today. I've been living outside Israel for the last, few decades. I have some contact. Most of my contacts are old, and I'm careful not to ask questions that would not be welcome or would not be basis for a constructive conversation with those people that in position to know. So, I was trying to do something on this very important topic in a way that, given my limitations, and not just my personal limitation, almost everybody, unless you have so-called a whistleblower or insider who is ready to talk, which is extremely unlikely. We had only one Vanunu. I had a great deal of limitations about how I can construe and explain things. Given these limitations, I was trying to trace Israel past and to look at certain kind of attitude and milestone that determine Israel history and determine the way that Israel thought about those issues a long time ago. And I believe that a great deal of this outlook still remain, even though today, obviously, great things have been mature. I mean, there is a real system of nuclear command and control. with a real architecture, and I do not know any of its current details in any of those. The principle that Israel from early days thought about its nuclear weapons was it has to be real, but also it has to be a last resort options for unthinkable situations, situations of unique and extremely unlikely moments. And I think over the years, it became clear that it's more something political than military, and we can go into that to explain what I mean by that.
Okay.
The two principles that I talked in the paper are, first, we're talking about a system which is largely a civilian system with very limited, only those who are strictly necessary are liaisoning with the military, with the
Yeah.
IDF, with those who can use certain kind of platform for launching and so forth. So I think the intersection between the military and civilians is very small, and it's highly compartmentalized. That means that there is a separation, organizational and physical, I believe, between nuclear and non nuclear assets and personnel. The custodianship, at least peacetime custodianship, of nuclear assets are not by the military. They are by the body that you can call, it used to have the name, the Scientific Bureau, the Scientific Establishment Administration. By now, I believe it's under the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission, which is equivalent to the US Department of Energy. And very few people in the military, still tens of people, possibly hundreds of people at the lower level, have access to some elements of that, but it's relatively very small. And those people who do not have a need to know and a need to have the access do not know. So those issues are hardly being studied and looked at various kinds of training, even to for senior officers, even for for 1 star or even 2 star generals. That's my understanding. Also, the system, I believe, is such that one person cannot make a decisive move, and it require on major decisions to have more than one person. So even though the prime minister is ultimately the important guy involved in the Israeli command and control system, he cannot do things on his own.
Okay.
So maybe this is for the beginning of the conversation on
Okay.
the first few things that I will start.
Yeah. So going through the paper, I find it, and this again, it goes to what you were just describing in terms of how it originated, not obviously having deep ability to see where that translates today per se, but looking at it historically, I find it fascinating that the civilian leadership made that decision to keep it out of the hands of the military side of MOD. You go into the details of that a bit in the paper. I think it would be really interesting and really fascinating for the listeners to kind of hear from you a little bit as to why that went the way it did. And, from my perspective, as someone who's spent a lot of time working in classified circles and on very sensitive issues, most often, anything that more than a few people know about, it's not a secret anymore. But the way that you retell the tale, Shimon Peres and David Ben Gurion were able to pull this off in a way that it really did stay compartment. It really did stay quiet for quite a while. So, first things first, why did they choose to go down the path of keeping it out of the hands of the military from what your read of the history is, and how did they go about keeping it so quiet?
Well, it's combination of many things historically constructed. I think initially it was always considered, and it still is, the most sensitive project that Israel has ever launched. I
Hmm.
mean, its decision to have a major nuclear program that fits the country needs was the fact that it is never acknowledged to this very day just shows the sensitivity that the issue was treated, has been treated, is treated by Israelis. By now, combination of both of incredible sense of bureaucratic convenience to use that kind of taboo and that kind of compartmentalization, the fact that it's very few people from the outside have a say, have a knowledge on these matters, create a sterile environment. And bureaucratically, in terms of governance, in terms of administration, it's fantastic to do things without any noise from the outside. Not just the media, but even the legislatures, even almost very little from the state control bodies, uh, very limited oversight. It's created a situation that it's very convenient for those professionals in charge, and their intimate relationship with the very few politicians, essentially the prime minister, and maybe two or three other ministers that have access to the minister of defense, and two or three other ministers that have access to those issues. So I believe that today, beyond the political issues remains the excuse. We have a certain kind of commitment with the United States. We have a certain
Yeah.
kind of understanding with the United States, and we cannot break that kind of commitment, which was given actually about 50 years ago, 1969, by the time that Golda Meir, met and agreed with President Nixon. I think that if should have been an interest in Israel or the United States to change things, I think change could have happened. I think it's very convenient not to revisit those issues, to let the attitude to be established and to be ritualized as the most important, the most sensitive issue, and keep it that way, and not allow people to ask old questions in a revisited way. I think there is a strong cultural, psychological reluctance to open those questions. The attitude is, it works fine, it works great, it's convenient,
Hmm.
politically, bureaucratically. There is no any public pressure to open it because the public understand that they shouldn't know anything about it. So why should we revisit it? There is no any interest to revisit it in any serious way. So it's not that there is some argument that is still valid. Those arguments have not looked in any serious way, definitely not by politicians, and I think even by bureaucrats. I think the real reason why it works so well is it has been solidified as a culture, and the culture is just amazing. This is more secretive culture than even the Mossad or the Israeli General Security Services, the Israeli, part of the Shin Bet, the FBI.
Yeah.
It's the most secretive organization that exists in Israel. To be promoted, you need to pass a periodic polygraph and so on. And except the head of that organization, all others are faceless, their names never published, and it's convenient for everybody. And that's the reason why it's more issues of culture and psychology than issue of strategic considerations today. Because as you said, everybody knows in Israel and outside that Israel has nuclear weapons. That's is not a secret. That's the worst kept secret.
Yeah, and I want to get into how it is. It's very strategic and has very technical implications as well. But as you say, I mean, it's a very political set of issues, and what it raises a couple of very specific questions, though, right? In terms of so at a certain point in the paper, you're telling the story of back in the '60s when these decisions start to come to the point where it really can't be contained anymore amongst
Yeah.
the leadership. There has to be a turning point. And do they stick with, the way that the IDF is postured vis-a-vis the nuclear program, or do they shift towards being more of a nuclear armed army? That has radical implications for the NC3 that has to
Yeah, yeah,
accompany
yeah,
the
yeah.
trajectory. And so that I mean, that leads up to where very much the structure is today. Was just wanted to ask if you could speak to that decision point, and I mean, it does just dovetail with what you were talking about with the politics that you were just describing. That kind of begins to answer the question, I think.
Yeah. So I believe that in 1962, long, long time ago, more than 57 or so years ago, um, there was a key meeting that essentially asked, with a few participants, when Ben felt that he needs to have a consensus, national consensus, among the few leaders who are well versed with military, strategic national affairs. And it was a way to put together the nuclear camp, which was at the time his deputy minister of defense and the CEO of the nuclear project, Shimon Peres, Uh, Decades later, he would become prime
Yeah.
minister and later even the president of Israel, with those who were against the nuclear project, who wanted to keep the Israeli army as conventional. By the way, they were against nuclear weapons, but they were not against nuclear research and R&D. They always thought that Israel should keep ahead, should keep some kind of edge over the other countries. They were against nuclearization of the conflict. They were against nuclearization of the region, but they always thought that Israel should keep itself ahead.
Hmm.
And in that meeting, ultimately, not many people know, but Shimon Peres of the early 60s, young, ambitious, smart, savvy in its own way, but without, I mean, he was Mr. Security in a sense. He was for years the Director General of the Ministry of Defense, and then so his interest in technology to compensate conventional army was something that was always part of him from the 50s forward. So in the early 60s, Shimon Peres was lobbying and was known by many people who were involved at the time in those issues, those matters, that he wanted Israel to follow the French case. That is to say, to conduct a test and to join the nuclear club and to adopt a more technological nuclear doctrine. And obviously, it would be involved with dramatic changes in the structure, in the doctrine, in the organization of the IDF. And the meeting in 62, even though the issue on the agenda was not that broad and that philosophical, apparently, it was about some chunk of money, whether it should go for the nuclear project to accelerate and to do more things, or whether it should buy some more tanks. Ben Gurion decided, and possibly he decided even earlier because he may have sensed his political limits vis-a-vis Kennedy. This was a year earlier when he understood where Kennedy stood. And maybe the line that we will not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons, a line that later on Paris will proud that he was the first to say it in public to President Kennedy when he met him in 1963. It's possible that Ben Gurion had used it even before. But I think that Ben Gurion already sensed of the limits that he can navigate that project. And the result was that in that critical meeting, he sided with the conventional army people. We're not going to make structural organizational changes with the IDF. We are not moving into a nuclear army. We are not going to conduct a test anytime soon. Definitely when you
Hmm.
say we're not going to be the first. Therefore, we are talking about options that would continue, that would be developed, but we continue with that kind of separation. I think that the separation between military and nuclear assets, organizations, and the view that the nuclear is really the nation's unique options for a rainy day. This was the legacy of it was established in that meeting, and it was that direction that they moved on. And it's never changed. So the IDF remained conventional. Yes, Israel did purchase and later on built of its own, surface to surface missiles that can carry nuclear weapons, but it was a little island or enclave within the Air Force that is not part of the normal Air Force. By the way, this is still the only part of the Air Force which is not recognized publicly. It's the facility where they have that wing that deals with those missiles. Still to this day,
Yeah.
it's the only facility of the Air Force which is classified,
Yeah.
and it became the way we do things. I think it
Well,
became very obvious that once a few years later, when Israel already had its first few cores, those cores, nuclear cores, were not given to the military. The custodianship remained by civilians under the prime minister, and those arrangements had to be, of course, elaborated, more detailed. And around that, I think, or my understanding is that the Israeli nuclear control system has evolved, over the decades.
so I most definitely want to come back to those instances of stress that probably
Yeah,
drove changes to how they approach that. But before we get there, something that you just alluded to, which makes me think of another scenario that I have a sense that you're going to contest. That in the paper you note that the way they approach it is that the program is an insurance policy under the control of prime minister, not a military system under the custodianship of the IDF. There are those instances in the paper, as you describe it, where they find themselves almost improvising because there are not standing procedures and well-defined lines of command in the moment of a crisis when use is actually realistic or increasingly realistic. We just had this conversation with Feroz not more than a couple of weeks ago, where he talked about that moment of crisis and the challenge that that creates when you have this bifurcation between nuclear and conventional,
Yeah.
and the implications of that for NC3 because of the communications requirements, because of the training that goes into it for the actual networks that are necessary. Was just curious if you could talk to that a little bit from the Israeli perspective. That would seem to me to be somewhat of a similar conundrum where if you're actually going to move from peacetime to crisis, but everything is ostensibly separated, the IDF is a conventional army and doesn't, do nuclear. The Air Force has just one siloed or a couple now, right? Units. How does that actually play out in reality? And doesn't that create significant strains on communications and command and control?
I think so, but one has to be extremely cautious. Even if we have some limited knowledge on 1967, and I think we do because the mass and the embryonic situation was unique, and I had access to people who were involved in those days in the actual actions, and they admit how embryonic and how confusing and how there was nothing to rely on.
Yep.
And I know a little, but not 1973, and it still was relatively embryonic, even though, in 1970, Israel did have some more capability. And in 1991, there were lessons out of each of those milestones, and I think there was element of improvisation in all that occasions, in all those milestones, 67, 73, and even 91. But without knowing that's how is the situation with Iran, with Pakistan, I think that today Israel has developed a mature and tangible system full of procedures, full of hardware and software of details. Even in the United States, if things goes suddenly wrong, everybody goes to uncharted territory. So once it became real, it's
Fair
scary
point.
to
Yep.
everybody. But I think that
Yep.
today Israeli system should not be looked at in terms of the historical understanding of what happened in 67, 73, and even not in 91, because even following 91, there were certain organizational changes that were made. The Minister of Defense at the time, Moshe Aarons, and Ehud Barak, the chief of staff, they have done some changes as a result of some pressure and tensions. So whatever exists today is, in my opinion, highly mature, highly sophisticated, and it's probably of the like that you have in any other mature nuclear weapon state. You can think of the UK, you can think of France, and even the United States.
Abner, I think it would be useful for our listeners if you could just spell out, a little bit about the 73 and 91 crises, because many of our listeners may not have been born, may not
Yeah.
remember what happened in those years.
Well, 1967, I'll start with 1967. This was the first time the crisis found Israel very close to completing some kind of nuclear device. And it was natural for the developers, and at least one senior military guy who was the liaison between the developers and the IDF, to think about scenarios, circumstances in which those kind of things could be put to use or to demonstration. By the way, the Israeli thinking was from early on, even before Israel had nuclear weapons, that given the fact that Israel has never acknowledged to have nuclear weapons, if and ever Israel would find itself in a need to show capability, it will be clearly a demonstration with some kind of statement. It would not be a use. It will be a demonstration of capability with some kind of statement, political statement, strategic statement. At least this was the thinking at the time. So in 67, they thought about this is embryonic capability being assembled for the first time as a device, not yet even a weapon, under what kind of circumstances a test or demonstration could be conceived. And that particular senior officer, at the time he was a colonel. Israel at the time did not have a brigadier general. There was no one-star general, so he was one rank below major general. He conceived idea for some kind of demonstrations over remote area of the Sinai, under circumstances that were never tested before, that were completely uncharted territories. In his mind, as the planner, it was extremely both scary and exciting. Other people take it to be, we just look at what we have. We didn't take it too seriously. I think for the prime minister at the time, Prime Minister Eshkol, it was psychological reassurance to think that he has something if everything else fails. And things could have gone wrong in quite a number of ways. I mean, everything was dependent on the success of the Israeli aerial preemption, and all kind of things could have been compromised and could go wrong. It was nice to know that you have final capability, you have a last resort capability. 1973, and that officer later on he proposed to actually to demonstrate after the war and to allow Israel to enter to the nuclear age, and he was dismissed by everybody. And among the very few people who knew about it, it became almost it never existed for years and years and years. When he told the story years later, he had to face, even though the story never published anywhere, he faced a trial. He was under arrest. His name is General Yitzhak Yaakov or Yatza. He had an affair. He had a trial in 2001. I was part of the story. Actually, it was simultaneous with my own affair. And it's a complex story, in which I'm not going into that right now. In 1973, there were a few dark moments that the Minister of Defense, Moshe Dayan, was pushing the possibility of demonstrating capability. He asked, apparently, at one time, the Prime Minister to shorten the way to bring assets closest to air bases. I believe that some early steps were made. There were a few Israeli pilots who knew who were trained in doing that kind of demonstrations. Luckily, the country, was able conventionally to overcome those dark moments, but it was thought, and I think that some steps were made. I wouldn't say there was one dramatic cabinet meeting or post cabinet meeting with a few ministers and the prime minister, which Dayan pushed the idea. He brought the head of the nuclear agency to brief the people, and the anti-nuclear or the conventional leaders, Yigal Alon and Israel Galili, they stopped that. They told the Prime Minister Golda Meir, we are not there yet. We should not go into that. Even though what Dayan apparently was asking was just to take some steps to shorten the timetable. Not to use it yet, not to demonstrate yet, but just to, if it's something just hypothetically 12 hours, let's make it an hour and a half in terms of assembling, putting together things, and moving assets. And I believe that actually assets were moved and certain preparations were made. 1991, there was concern that Saddam Hussein may have chemical weapons and he may send those missiles towards Israel, and what should be the Israeli results. And I think that certain preparations were made too. And as a result, after the war, some organizational changes were made in terms of command and control, both at the IDF and the Ministry of Defense. Essentially, a special division was made for what they called special means, with the number two there. The head of that was civilian. Number two was brigadier general. It still exists, and he running military office. So this is the kind of the liaison that exists both at the IDF and the Ministry of Defense on those matters. The details of those organizational changes is not fully clear. We know that there was a conflict between, at the time, the chief of staff, Ehud Barak, later on to be the prime minister of Israel, and Moshe Aarons, the minister of defense. But some major organizational changes were made as a result of the realization that the system was not ready in case it will have to come to a use.
So, Avner, how do you see that then reflected in the kinds of negative versus positive control measures and systems that were introduced in the Israeli force?
Well, I believe that for many years, and I tend to think it's even today, there is a physical and organizational separation between the nuclear assets, the core, and between the platform, the launching platforms, and the military who will do that. Whether you can still do it when Israel moved to the sea with submarines, I tend to think that's still the case, but I do not know exactly what's the situations with the submarines. But I believe
Hmm.
that at least before that, decades earlier, when Israel had only aircraft and Jericho missiles, there was a strict separation between the assets. And in order to have the fully ready to go, various kind of steps needed to be done by military and civilian people to make the situations ready to go. It was not automatic. And
And do we know if there are actual physical controls or permissive action links or any such system in use in Israel? Is there any knowledge of?
I assume that Israel has established its own permission action links, PALs. Um, I believe that by the very physical separation of cores and who has access to the cores, um, you already create strong both negative and positive control over those assets. Uh, I believe that Israel, from what I told, generally speaking, Israel has spent over the years, a great deal of money in designing quite a sophisticated architecture to deal with those issues.
Hmm.
And at least one site that I know about, the highly classified site, the guarding of that site is just amazing, something from another world. The layers of security and guarding that goes on.
So, as you said
And I,
earlier, it's
and,
in a sense it's the worst kept secret because by now we've got probably some thousands of people who have been involved in a physical manner in the development of different weapon systems, design, analysis, possibly computer testing. You've got all this organizational infrastructure in the military. On the
Yeah,
civilian side,
yeah,
you've got all the political decision makers and their advisors.
yeah,
This is a large number of people who actually know what's going
right,
on at some level, even if it's highly
yeah.
compartmented. Yet, as far as I can determine from what you've written, there's no actual, what's the term, accountability or oversight to the Israeli parliament and therefore to the population. Or I'm missing something. Can you explain?
You're missing something. I think there is a tiny liaisoning areas of some reporting to some bodies within tiny bodies within the Israeli parliaments that have some at least formal oversight. I don't think there is real oversight by outside bodies. There are layers of internal oversights, and often people who are involved, once they get older, they become, layers of board of trustees that involve in overseeing that kind of system. It's the kind of, I mean, you have personnel that stay with it for decades, for a long time, even when they're no longer being paid or part of the personnel. This was at a very top level of policy oversight, and I think technical oversight. So probably you're right. Probably there are definitely people at the level of hundreds, and in some cases thousands of people who were involved in the history of those projects. The Israeli public, including Israeli journalists, knows very little about it. Those secrets remain alive. Israel had only one whistleblower from Dimona, from the nuclear facilities, and that facility had, probably more than 10,000 employees over the years, maybe 20,000, who knows. And there was only one who became public. The sense of avowal to secrecy, national secrecy on this issue is very strong, and the fact is that those issues did not become public. And there is also a formal system to prevent it. I mean, there is a censorship. There is a formal system to deal with it.
And Avner, that also means that there's no domestic legal framework other than the most general ones that relate to military planning and decision making.
No, no, I do not say that. I believe, and I have hints that I heard, that in the last decades, the Attorney General and some of his people looked into the legality, and some work on that issue was made. It was highly classified, but for years and years, for decades, the attorney general and the legal system were completely outside. It was kind of total gray area. It's still gray area in the sense that there is no law that covers those issues. It's outside the law. But I believe that today there are detailed procedures that pass the inspection or the oversight of the attorney general and a few of his aides that have the clearance to deal with those issues.
And so there was a lawsuit recently, was there not, on this matter? Can you relate what happened in that lawsuit?
Well, I was involved in that lawsuit. I was one of the writers of that lawsuit. That lawsuit was kindly dismissed. When I'm saying kindly, it was said that we asked the Supreme Court, to intervene towards pressing the government to legislate, to enact a law. And they say maybe it's a good idea, but that's not our job. It should be some public debate about that. And they were nice to us that they did not ask us to pay the, the expenses of having the court considering the case. So we were not fined by the expenses of the course. And the language was somewhat kind to us, saying that maybe there is a problem here, but it didn't go anywhere. And I knew it's not going to go anywhere. We thought it needs to be done. We did it, but it didn't go anywhere.
Avner, if I could go back
Yeah.
to the otherworldly security measures that are in place, etc., and something that you began to speak about in the paper a bit, with the maturing of the NC3 system to kind of even a C4 or C4I architecture.
Yeah.
That fourth C that you're referring to, I think, it's something. It came up a little bit in the workshop back in January. It's something that
Yeah.
we've been talking about on this podcast
Yeah.
extensively. How the cyber element starts to factor into NC3 for nuclear weapons states. You mentioned the layers of security. I think anyone who has their salt in the cybersecurity business knows you assume breach. So as you talk about the fourth C there and the layers and the impenetrability, if you will, the otherworldly nature of that security, what's the nature of the conversation around that fourth C and what it means for NC3 in the Israeli context?
Well, I do know that Israel has, being a startup nation, so to speak, as it's being
Yeah,
referred in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, I believe
yeah,
that Israel has invested a great deal of money to secure its national systems against hacking. It's the country that created the idea for the Stuxnet in dealing with Iran. So Israel spent a lot of effort to try to both on the offense side and the defense side of cyber. How exactly they defended the nuclear system and how it's incorporated with the nuclear system, except the understanding that a great deal of money and human resources that were invested into that, I cannot, I do not really know details.
yeah,
I think the fact that assets are being separated, it save a lot of the headaches. And the fact that Israel still keeps and is committed to keep monopoly, regional monopoly. I mean, the fact that Israel is the only country in the Middle East with with a full nuclear weapons capability. No other country. I mean, things obviously would have been different had Iran had actual nuclear weapons. But as long as Israel has this luxury of being the only one with the capability, they can afford, and they know that nobody can attack them within hours with nuclear weapons. It gave a certain kind of luxury that allows you, to separate the assets and to keep some kind of distance until those assets are fully assembled, say
yeah,
hours or so, because you know that did you have enough warning and no hit from the blue can come at any moment. You are not in that kind of situation. It's give you a certain kind of luxury. One thing which I think it needs to be said, I believe
yeah,
that if all Israeli leaders ever, prime ministers, Benjamin Netanyahu is the most knowledgeable, the most concerned, the most conscious and think about those issues. In part,
mm,
not because he think about it so much as weapons to be used. First, he is the most committed to keep Israeli, um, monopoly, nuclear monopoly. He is the one who was very ready to go to attack Iran. But he see nuclear weapons as, whether they are declared or non-declared, as really part of the equation of power, the way that the country is being perceived. The and he sees Israel with nuclear weapons as something radically different as Israel without nuclear weapons. I think among all Israeli leaders, he's the most conscious about it. He's the most strategic, and I believe that he had many visits to Dimona and to the headquarters and to
yeah,
the Navy. He cares about this issue. El Barak, for example, in the 2 years that he was prime minister, apparently he never visited Dimona, not even once. It
hmm,
doesn't mean that he didn't care, but it was not in the day to day something that he thought that much about it. Um, uh, Prime Minister Netanyahu is very much see himself as the nuclear commander of Israel.
interesting. I think the point is interesting in that you mentioned um, them being the only ones in the neighborhood that maintain such a capability, and therefore it kind of puts them in their own unique position. What's Yeah, are you familiar with the phrasing "no bus"? This is a an acronym from the National Security Agency crowd that talks about nobody but
Of
us.
course, yeah,
Yeah, in terms of security
yeah.
vulnerabilities, in terms of cyber combat, that leaves no one a monopoly. And what's really interesting about it, right, is as we move into this world where even for the United States to think about its nuclear command and control, there are realistic worlds in which the Chinese, the Russians, and others, the Iranians increasingly, have developed the ability to find these vulnerabilities and exploit them, which puts those sorts of, Prime Minister Netanyahu's perspective on this, it puts that sort of reliance or deterrent posture really at risk. So
And
that's more of what I was
that's
getting
why
at.
he thinks so much about it. That's why he
Yeah.
gives a lot of money for that. That's why
Hmm.
he meets those people. He is personally involved. He it's very important for him to be in control of that, and he pushed more resource to those issues than people before him. At least that's the rumor
Fascinating.
that I heard.
Yeah. That also reminds
By
me
the
of
way,
something.
you asked me how did I know about the comment of Ehud Barak about the two people.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
this was in the context of the big debate in Israel that involved possible corruption, but also very strategic issue. It had to do with the issue of the submarine. It was Benjamin
Okay.
Netanyahu who pushed towards very large Israeli fleet of submarine. He wanted to think he wanted that Israel would have 8 or 9
Hmm.
these long-term special diesel German submarines.
Yeah.
All the others felt that 4 or 5 is enough, 6 is above and beyond. And he was behind this push, and it was a relative of his who were the lawyers for the guy who was the representative for the shipyard company that was involved in selling those assets. Um, and there are still open issues about whether there was issues of financial corruptions and all that. But it was in that kind of discussion that Ehud Barak said uh, that on nuclear decisions, yes, the prime minister on this issue has a unique position, and sometimes he can overrule Minister of Defense and his strategic preferences and priorities can overrule others. But nevertheless, on decision like that, especially of use, he cannot make a decision alone. So it was. I think he was not supposed to say it. He said it in the context of podcast that he gave himself to Aretz on this big dispute, big controversy over the additional submarines that Benjamin Netanyahu was pushing for Israel to purchase. Later on, Netanyahu said that he talks about not necessarily about a fleet of 8 or 9, but rather to replace the older one that's about to be retired, and Israel started to receive them in the late 90s and the early this millennia. Um, and the issue has not been, and people say that the attorney general decided not to investigate because of concern over secrecy of those of those matters, of those highly secretive matters, because a lot of people thought that those issues needs to be investigated. The prime minister himself needs to be investigated, and yet the attorney
Hmm.
general from early on he said, on this I don't want to investigate.
Interesting. You had mentioned, as we had gone through this a little bit, you mentioned the submarine piece of this, and what I'd ask is if we could think about that in terms of the NC3 requirements a little bit. It's one of the fundamental questions, even when we were talking to Fiona and to Elsa about the China
Yeah.
context. With that in mind, and with the agreement that ostensibly remains in place dating back to Nixon with the United States, the fundamental two-tier principle that you've laid out in the paper, with the introduction of the submarine based capability and what that in reality requires, how does that put a strain on things as far as you understand it in terms of the nature of the conversation internally?
Well, there is nothing that came in open sources about that question, so it's a question that I am curious about. I discuss
Yeah.
with a few people who are analysts like myself who may or may not know something about it. Um, Obviously, the introduction of submarine had to change a great deal and to add elements to the Israeli nuclear control system. No question about that. Uh, whether whether it broke this, what I call the part of the Israeli DNA of the separation between assets, nuclear and non-nuclear, organizational, and I do not know. I think it put some strains. Obviously, submarines move to sea for weeks. Communication with submarine is much more complicated, especially when they are underwater. Um, I believe that various tests were made, systems were developed, and I know that the Attorney General were involved in some aspect of that. Whether it broke the old principles of separation or not, I'm not sure,
Hmm.
and it's an open question. Whether even the personnel in submarines that deal with nuclear assets would be Navy sailors or would be other civilians who are for
Hmm.
some missions. I tend to believe that it's unlikely that you have nuclear assets. That's my own personal view, given history and giving attitude and giving logic. I think n- normal peacetime situation, including with tension with Iran, it's very unlikely to me to think that Israeli submarines would sail with nuclear assets on them normally. I do
Hmm.
not know, but I think that separation, which was consistent with some political, it's Israel has elements of caution and resolve, and I think that on this issue, caution prevailed, and I would be surprised if that had changed. One thing that I think I would like to put in on record because it's important and it's not commonly known. You know, the 1973 war created a sense of panic, and there was a lot of lessons that were learned after the war, including on the nuclear issue. It's quite possible that we just celebrated, so to speak, the 40 years of the Vela um, double flash from 1979. We're now in October.
Hmm.
This was 22nd of September 1979, so it's 40 years from now. And I personally believe it had to do with the legacy of the war. But what is not known is that Israel at the time considered and rejected, out of caution, out of prudence, out of all sorts of considerations, the introduction of tactical nuclear weapons. It decided against that, even though I think the R&D was almost completed in terms of
Hmm.
artillery shells, and I mean that would have meant that introduction of nuclear assets in big
Sure.
numbers to the Israeli IDF, and the decision was we're not going that direction. So Israel ultimately does not have nuclear artillery shells and those kind of tactical nuclear weapons. It was a decision against introduction of tactical nuclear weapons. This was after the big trauma of the 1973 war. Certain things were done to address that trauma in the nuclear realm, but not introduction of tactical nuclear weapons. So Israel always has this tension between element of resolve, especially technical resolve, and elements of caution and prudence. And in some areas, prudence, including some operational area, prudence prevailed. My personal guess is that normal peacetime, the principle of separation between assets still remains, but I'm not
Avner,
certain.
on the assumption that the communications infrastructure that supports the command system is dual capable, in other words, it supports conventional as well as nuclear
Yeah,
operations, with the possible exception of the VLF station, which I think is located at Dimona, which would be probably only used for the submarine leg if and when it deployed with nuclear weapons. But the rest of it,
You're talking about the big antennas?
yeah, yeah. But the rest of it is pretty
Mhm.
much dual capable for conventional as well as nuclear delivery operations.
I would think some are, and maybe there are dedicated areas too. But
There might be some dedicated circuits, that's true, although an adversary could probably not easily tell the difference. But with that kind of mixing up, if you like, of the two systems, um, how do you see the risk of, first of all, entanglement, as some have put it, where conventional operations force an adversary, whether they're conventionally or nuclear armed, to assume that the conventional operations that they're facing are in fact a precursor to a nuclear strike, and therefore they better redouble their attack, whether it's conventional or nuclear, to limit their own damage. And secondly, to what extent can you say that the Israeli force assume that their conventional communication systems are already infiltrated, if you like, by adversarial counter NC3 forces, whether they're cyber, SIGINT, or other capacities. This being sort of a prevailing assumption now in the West that the bad guys are already inside one's own command and control system, and you have to be ready to deal with that at time of crisis, but you can't really stop it in advance.
yeah. First, I would confess that I know very little factually. I've no doubt that those issues that you raised are being very thoroughly discussed and studied, and generated a great deal of thinking. That's, I'm sure. I also think that Israel has been doing, is doing a great deal of testing Iranian capabilities. I mean, Israel prime adversary these days is Iran, whether it's through its proxies and whether in Iran itself. Um, as you know, or maybe you do not know, but that was published in the Wall Street Journal, and I believe it was true. At one point during the tension between Israel and Iran, I think it was 2012, Israeli transportation aircraft landed in some sites in Iran. The United States saw it, was very, very nervous. It stayed on the ground for some time, not not many hours. I'm not exactly sure how much. Uh, I believe that this was part of Israeli preparing in case uh, and testing Iranians' capabilities, preparing sites and possibilities, and also testing Iranian capabilities. I think a great deal of quiet war is done in an effort to test and to see what Iran can and cannot do, and how much Iran knows about Israel. Um, I also tend to think that about really existential systems such as the nuclear system, some element of it, and it may go beyond just the communication with the submarines, is truly dedicated to ensure that the prime minister would have a secure communication with those people that he needs to be in touch in cases. And that's even the time that Israel still has the monopoly, because you have to prepare that monopoly could be erased, in a worst case scenario in a short time, months. So you need to do planning much before that. And I tend to think that Israel, especially under Netanyahu, has put the money and the resources to do that kind of planning. So I cannot respond to you in any concrete way to the questions. I thought the questions that you ask are good questions and intriguing. Uh, but I'm almost certain that money and resources were given to think about those questions.
Or given the speed at which these dynamics or these interactions are now occurring, both, how can I put it, between the heads of state or senior leaders, in social media and in direct diplomacy and through mass media on the one hand, and through actual physical movements of the kind that you just described, occurring at a time of very high tension, which seems almost precipitous to me, because if that had been misread, assuming that they saw it in the first place, by the Iranians, it could have led to, a counter escalation that would have in turn spiraled in ways that may not have been controlled by either side. That's precisely what entanglement, means. Um, how confident do you think we are that the Israeli prime minister could communicate with the right Iranian in a real near hot war or crisis with the existing means of communication? I mean, one of the arguments that was advanced at the conference where you gave your paper, by the former vice president for security at Google, was that these systems are really going to fail robustly at times of maximum stress. They're not entirely reliable for both technical and human reasons, and that we need a very simple, direct way of communicating that's highly secure. And I wondered if you had any thoughts, given what you just said about that Iran-Israel interaction, as to whether such a system might be useful to Israel and Iran.
Yeah. I do not think that that exists. I can tell you something of the last few days, which is kind of interesting. Uh, so a few days ago, 2 days ago, there was a very long and urgent meeting of the Israeli Defense Cabinet. And apparently, it was in response to what happened in Saudi Arabia, the combined attack of drones and cruise missiles over those Saudi's facilities. Uh, People have already pointed out that the Iranians may have capabilities that could pinpoint Israeli targets with high resolution, with high accuracy. And Netanyahu, apparently, this was the headlines of the last 48 hours, 24 hours, talks about adding billions of Israeli currency just to beef up Israeli defense capabilities against that kind of attack. There was even conversation that the Iranian talks about this attempt to kill, the head of the Revolutionary Guard who involved in the Middle East, as an excuse to attack Israel in a similar way that they had attacked Saudi Arabia just a few weeks ago. And obviously, Israel is committed. If it, everybody was stunned the fact that so far there was no response, there was no military response to that attack. And the view is that this would bolster Iranian sense of dare and aggression. And apparently, Israel is contemplating it, and there is even emergency call to allocate a lot of money just to improve those defensive capabilities against that kind of attack. So a sense of vulnerability vis-a-vis Iranians' capabilities, offensive capabilities, is something that is being talked a great deal, especially by a prime minister who is so much obsessed by Iran, such as Benjamin Netanyahu.
But can you imagine circumstances where Netanyahu might actually need to speak to Khomeini to try and sort out a problem when the missiles are flying or are about to fly?
Not really, I don't think that he has means to do that unless the Mossad have some emergency channels. I mean, probably you would have to do it through the French or the Germans, or and to do it through somebody else, it's compromising already. Um, It's a very intriguing and interesting question. I do not have an answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that there is a secure communication system shared by Israel, the Palestinians, and the Jordanians to
Yes,
orchestrate on a daily basis
yes,
supply, which is,
yeah.
existential need and an existential threat to all three parties if they don't.
No, that's usually work on quite mundane and routine issues. I mean,
Yeah, but
yes,
what?
it's being used, but it's not an existential issue of such an attack. I mean, the kind of scenarios that you conceive with Iran do not exist with the Palestinians. So it's a very different types of systems and attitude towards those systems and everything else.
No, I understand that, and you're right. But the point is that it is at least conceivable that mortal enemies can need to communicate even at times of near or actual war because their populations require it. It's not the same kind of existential threat, but they still actually do cooperate under those circumstances. So,
As you know, at the time that Israel in 2011, 2012, uh, Israel refused to give a very long warning to United States. Israel insisted that it has the right to defend itself and possibly to attack Iran. It was understood that if Israel is going to initiate such an offense, the United States would know a little time in advance, but not weeks and not many days. And the United States was very, very, very nervous about that. A lot of U.S. intelligence assets were applied at Israel just to, and there was a time that Netanyahu asked the Israeli military and the Israeli uh, defense assets to be ready within 30 days to attack Iran. And then he got negative reaction from his own chiefs. And ultimately, he never had a majority for that in his cabinet, whether it was bluff or whether it was serious. To this day, we do not know. And it was in that context that Israel did various kind of risky issues, including possible landing on Iranian territory, which the United States did watch and was very, very nervous. So if you don't have that kind of fully understanding with your closet ally, I doubt whether Israel established some kind of emergency with Iran itself.
if I can just ask one final question. One of the fascinating aspects of the January workshop where you presented your paper was that we were able to compare how nuclear weapons related to the political cultures of the different nuclear weapon states. And we discovered there were 7 or 8 different, maybe even 9, quite distinct models of decision making
That's right.
historically and currently in the nuclear weapon states.
Right.
And the question that I wanted to ask is whether the role that nuclear weapons play in terms of um, the role of the Prime Minister's office as the senior nuclear commander on the one hand, and the role that they play psychologically with respect to Israeli national identity is parallel to that of France, where nuclear weapons were actually constitutive. They actually were one of the essential building blocks of the French presidency under de
Yeah.
Gaulle. Whereas in the United States, for example, you can make the argument that nuclear weapons are not epiphenomenal, but the presidency as an institution pre-existed nuclear weapons. It may have strengthened the president's hand, but so did many other things. And in a sense, it plays even perhaps less of a role psychologically and politically in some respects in the United States than it does in France.
Yeah.
How do you see this in Israel?
I definitely agree with you. I think this is fundamental, intriguing point, and I tend to agree with you that the Israeli point is somewhat similar, perhaps even stronger than the French case. I would say two things just to elevate this point. Israel has created over the last 3 or 4 years highly classified. No journalists were ever allowed to be inside, but apparently it's huge really huge underground center of emergency of the Israeli, not just the cabinet, but the representation of every agency that needs to be active at time of emergency, somewhere in the hills of Judea, in outside Jerusalem, 10-15 minutes. Apparently there are tunnels that goes from the prime minister office and possibly from the Knesset towards that underground, underground large facility. Apparently it cost quite a number of billions of possibly even dollars to build that thing, and it was built since the Iran issue. It was built under Netanyahu. Netanyahu became prime minister in 2009. And I think that under Netanyahu, that issue that may not have been so strong as part of the Israeli prime minister have become much stronger, in part because of the investment in the nuclear issue, in this huge general facility underground somewhere. Benjamin Netanyahu has created, under the prime minister office, national cyber authority. And as I said, this prime minister is highly see himself as the one on in charge of nuclear assets. So I think you're right, and I think this is one of the reasons why it was primarily under him that the attorney general got involved. I think that he even wanted to give it some kind of classified, but something that has some manifestation in some legal procedures about the role of the prime minister. So I think your question was fantastic, because there is a lot of indirect evidence that support what you just said, even stronger than France.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of how the British ran their system for many years too, was with this unspoken set of gentlemanly rules on how we're going to run a nuclear weapons force and make nuclear decisions. And it's only
Right.
recently that some of that has been formalized with parliamentary oversight and so forth. But that was because there was demand for political legitimacy made on the state, and they had to respond. In the UK, it sounds like that hasn't happened yet in Israel. From outside, the
I think some of it was made in Israel, but not through laws. Not and you see, in Israel there is no. I mean, I saw it in the Supreme Court when I put that petition with a few of my colleagues. There was almost no interest. There was, I published a few op-eds, but there was almost no interest. There was no any pressure. There is no any curiosity. There is no any support. I mean, the Israeli public supports so much the present situation, under which it is ignorant. It delegates its authority to those who are supposed to know, those who are supposed to make those decisions, and people feel comfortable about that.
Yep.
And I think even now in the election campaign, in a tacit way, not open way, Prime Minister Netanyahu made himself very clear. I'm the one who made this institution, the Prime Minister office, that strong, and I'm the only one who is fitted to hold it because of certain things that are connected with me. He didn't say it fully openly, but it was obvious.
Yeah. It's an interesting set of questions. I'm going to have to say that I regret that we're going to have to come back to it, maybe perhaps at the next discussion. Avner, you've given us more time than we had originally asked for. Thank you so much for going out of your way to do this podcast with us here today. I think this has been kind of a remarkable conversation, one that I know I haven't heard some of the details of before. So really appreciate you joining us and having this discussion.
Yeah. Well, it has been my pleasure, but I still want to highlight that a great deal for all of us, has been in this conversation speculative and conjectures and raising all sorts of hypothetical questions and wonders and puzzles that none of us, certainly not myself, have factual answers to that.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Brilliant.
Thank you again, Avner. As always, thanks to our listeners. We'll be back next week with a new episode of The Fourth Leg. and we'll be speaking with Daryl Press about the rapidly changing character of nuclear deterrence and both strategic and crisis stability, or as one should begin to think about it, crisis instability more prominently, and how that all connects with NC3. Be sure to check it out. Until then, subscribe to the pod. We'll see you online on Twitter and via the website. Until then, thanks to everybody for listening, and we look forward to hearing from you.